She never spoke a single word until she met a dog who wouldn't leave her side. When Sheriff Silas found a golden retriever barking into a burning car, he never imagined what lay inside. A girl, chained, silent, and forgotten. But what happens next will shake an entire town, because that girl isn't just a victim, and that dog isn't just a pet. Together, they will uncover a secret so dark it almost cost him his daughter, his wife, and maybe his soul. Don't blink. This is the story of how silence saved a life. The town of Elk Hollow, Wyoming, lay buried beneath a relentless whiteout. The storm had rolled in around dusk, swallowing the pine-covered hills and the narrow roads that stitched through them. Snow fell in dense sheets, piling against shuttered windows and creaking porches. Wind howled like an old ghost across the desolate ridges. By midnight, visibility was down to 10 feet, and most of the town huddled in flickering candlelight, praying the power stayed on. Sheriff Silas Monroe wasn't home. He was never home when storms came. Silas was a man carved out of the Wyoming landscape, tall, broad-shouldered with eyes the color of slate, and a jawline like a canyon wall. His Stetson had weathered more winters than most of the town's residents. At 42, he was known for being steady, quiet, and fiercely protective, especially since the accident that had taken his wife 3 years ago. Since then, his daughter Willa had not spoken a single word. Silas didn't press her. He'd lost his own voice for a while, too, just in different ways. Tonight, he drove slowly along Ridge Hollow Road, tires crunching through fresh drifts. The headlights of his patrol truck fought the snow like 2 weary soldiers. In the passenger seat, a golden retriever sat alert, ears twitching golden fur dusted with flakes. His name was Bruno, 6 years old, and unlike any dog Silas had ever known. Bruno had been a rescue abandoned as a pup, found tied to a tree in the Sawtooth Valley with a broken paw. They'd bonded instantly. Bruno was more than a companion. He was a sentinel, calm, intuitive, and fiercely loyal. Kids in town called him the Golden Deputy, though Bruno didn't care for titles. What he did care about, however, was the scent he'd just picked up. Without warning, the retriever rose, nose pressed against the side window, then let out a single, sharp bark. Deep, urgent. Silas slowed the truck. "What is it, boy?" Another bark louder. Then Bruno began to paw at the dashboard. That's when Silas saw it. A flicker of orange through the snow, barely perceptible. But there, he swerved off the road, tires sliding in the powder as the headlights swept across a twisted shape half buried in the ditch. A sedan, dark gray, front end crumpled against a pine trunk. Smoke, or maybe steam, hissed from under the hood. Flames licked at the windshield's edge. Silas slammed the truck into park. "You stay here," he said, out of habit. But Bruno was already out the door, bounding through the snow. Silas followed Boots, plunging into knee-deep drifts. The heat hit him, before the smoke acrid, choking. He pulled his scarf over his mouth and approached the vehicle. The driver's side was caved in. A man slumped behind the wheel, motionless, blood staining the airbag. Silas tried the door. Locked. He cupped his hands to the glass, peered inside, then froze. A face, small pale eyes wide with terror. In the back seat, a girl no more than 10 or 11, her wrists glinting with metal, chained. "God Almighty," Silas muttered. Bruno was at the rear door, barking furiously. Tail-stiff body angled like a battering ram. Flames crawled higher across the hood. There was no time. Silas drew his baton and smashed the rear passenger window. Glass shattered snow, whipping in. "Cover your face," he yelled. Not sure if she could even hear. The girl shrank away, but her eyes never left his. He reached inside, tried the door. Child locks. He cursed, shoved half his body through the broken glass. The chains were wrapped tight around the seat base. Padlocked. No key. He drew his service pistol, turned the barrel to the chain's anchor point. Turn away. The shot cracked through the storm. The girl flinched but didn't scream. The chain snapped. He pulled her out, nearly weightless in his arms. As he backed away, the dashboard exploded into flame. They ran. Snow swirled around them like smoke. 20 yards, 30. Then, with a roar that drowned even the wind, the gas tank ignited. The explosion flared orange against the blizzard, sending flaming debris spinning through the air. At the truck, Bruno barked and leapt at the door. Through the windshield, a small face appeared. Willa, watching everything. Her dark hair was pulled into 2 braids, her eyes enormous and silent, locked on the girl in her father's arms. Silas opened the rear door, laid the girl gently onto the seat next to Willa. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now." But the girl didn't respond. She didn't even cry. She just turned slowly to look at Willa. And Willa, silent for years, reached out and took the girl's hand. No words passed between them. But something did. Something ancient. Something healing. And in that frozen truck, as smoke billowed into the sky, and 2 girls sat in silence, Bruno lay at their feet, eyes watchful, tail thumping faintly. The storm had passed, but the town of Cedar Hollow remained cloaked in a brittle hush, as if the snow itself held its breath. The world outside the small community hospital was a frozen canvas of pine trees and frost-bitten rooftops. Inside, the heat hummed softly, but the air was thick with questions. Sheriff Silas Monroe stood near the window of room 204, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the pale girl lying under a fleece blanket. June hadn't spoken since her rescue. Her hair now clean, but still matted at the ends, splayed across the pillow like strands of ash. Her small frame looked even smaller in the oversized gown. Her eyes, gray, too old for someone her age, stayed fixed on the ceiling tiles, as if afraid to look anywhere else. Dr. Mabel Hawthorne, head physician at Cedar Hollow Medical, entered the room quietly. She was in her late 50s, tall and willow-thin, with steel-gray hair, tucked into a neat bun. Her posture was regal but unassuming, and she moved like someone used to being gentle in a world that often wasn't. Mabel had a way of speaking only when necessary. Her voice always, even her tone, shaped by years of delivering bad news in the kindest way she knew. "She hasn't made a sound." Mabel set her voice low. "But there are signs, Silas." "Signs?" Silas turned toward her. Mabel pulled a clipboard from her side, flipping through notes. Old bruising, ligature marks on her ankles and wrists, small burn scars healed but visible, all in different stages. She's been through something prolonged, something systematic. Silas's jaw clenched. Whoever did this is a monster. Mabel finished nodding and careful. She has a number tattooed behind her left ear, faded, almost gone. I had to part her hair to see it. It reads 418. Silas blinked. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But it's not random. It looks like a brand." In the corner of the room, Bruno stirred. The 7-year-old golden retriever had refused to leave June's side since the rescue. His thick golden fur made him look like a creature carved from sunlight, but his eyes, deep amber, were watchful, serious. The moment June had been wheeled in, Bruno had trotted after her stretcher, laying down beside the hospital bed with a soft grunt. When nurses tried to move him, he growled, not a threat, but a warning. Since then, he hadn't left. "Bruno hasn't let anyone else near her," Silas murmured, watching the dog, even Willa. At the mention of her name, the door creaked slightly open, revealing a petite figure wrapped in a green wool coat. Willa Monroe. Silas's daughter stood silently in the doorway, her auburn hair cascading in soft curls beneath a knitted hat. She was 8 small for her age, with pale skin and freckled cheeks that gave her a porcelain-like fragility. Willa had not spoken a word in almost 2 years ever since her mother's death in a car accident. Trauma had taken her voice, and since then her words came only in drawings or gestures. Mabel stepped aside, gently giving Willa space. The girl clutched a folded piece of paper in her mittened hands and walked slowly to June's bedside. Bruno raised his head, then seemed to sense no danger, and laid it back down. Willa looked at June, who turned her eyes at last, tracking the newcomer with cautious curiosity. Silas held his breath as his daughter unfolded the paper and placed it gently on the tray table beside June's untouched lunch. It was a simple drawing. 2 girls standing beneath a tree, one holding a leash. Between them a dog, golden unmistakably. Bruno wagged his tail beneath a bright sun. On the back of the paper, in painstaking block letters, Willa had written, "June, is that your name?" June stared at the page for a long moment. Then slowly she reached out and touched the word with trembling fingers. She nodded. Not a sound. Not a whisper, but her hand curled over the paper like it was something sacred. Her other hand, wrapped in gauze, reached for the pencil beside her bed and wrote beneath Willa's question, "Yes?" It was the first acknowledgement. A name. A reclaiming. Willa smiled small shy and sat at the foot of the bed. Silas felt something bloom in his chest, a fragile kind of hope. Mabel gave him a look that said, "Everything. Let them be." They stepped into the hallway. "I'll contact a trauma specialist," Mabel said. "But Silas, I think this is more than just medical. That number, the chains, the state she was found in. Someone was keeping her like a possession. Silas's eyes were far away, and planning to move her. That fire wasn't random." "I agree." Mabel handed him a photo she had taken of the number behind June's ear. "I'm sending this to the State Child Protection Unit. Maybe they'll find something." As they spoke back in the room, Willa had pulled another piece of paper from her coat pocket. She drew while June watched. This time, Willa drew Bruno. The dog, as if knowing, shifted his heavy head onto June's lap. She froze for a moment, then rested her hand gently on his fur. Bruno wagged his tail. Once then sighed and closed his eyes. The connection was quiet but unshakable. That evening, as the sun dipped below the snowy treetops, casting a pink glow across the town, Silas sat in his patrol car outside the hospital. He stared at the photo on his phone, the number 418. A code. A scar. A clue. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it meant danger. And he would find the truth no matter what it cost. Inside the hospital, June slept for the first time without trembling. Bruno stayed at her side, his head rising and falling with each breath. Across the room, Willa watched her sketchbook in her lap, her small fingers tracing the outline of a new drawing. A girl rising from the snow. A golden dog beside her and light breaking through the clouds. The morning after the fire brought with it a hush over Crossridge, the kind that blanketed the town not with snow, but with uneasy silence. Smoke had long ceased from the wreckage, but the scent of burnt metal and gasoline still clung to the wind curling between the tall pines like a warning whispered to the trees. Sheriff Silas Monroe stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his boots crunching over frozen ground as he surveyed what remained of the charred sedan. Bruno sat by his side, tail, still ears perked, nose twitching toward the husk of the vehicle. Bruno, the 6-year-old golden retriever with a coat. The color of late summer wheat had not left Silas's side since the rescue. He was unusually alert, like something in the ash unsettled him. Beside the twisted frame, Deputy Ramius. Trent crouched, his gloved hands carefully sifting through the snow-dusted debris. Ramius, a wiry man with sharp cheekbones and a habit of talking to himself under stress, was in his early 40s and had been with Silas for almost 5 years. He was loyal, methodical, and carried the perpetual air of someone expecting bad news. Found a match on the plates, he muttered. Glancing up at Silas, car was registered to a Russell Pike ring. Any bells? Silas's brow furrowed. The name was familiar, but the memory stayed just out of reach like a dream dissolving after waking. Not right off. Run a background check. See what comes up. Ramius nodded and continued digging. Minutes later, his hand emerged with something half-melted, scorched black, but still intact, a thick-soled boot. Inside, stuffed beneath the lining, was a small heat-seared envelope. Ramius pulled it free, eyes narrowing as he read the crumpled slip inside Sheriff. He said, holding it out, "You'll want to see this." Silas unfolded the paper slowly. It was a wire transfer receipt dated 2 weeks prior, $50,000 sent to an organization called the Rathmore Foundation. The sender's name was Russell Pike. Silas's jaw tightened. Rathmore, now that name he knew. Back in the sheriff's station beneath the faded maps and bulletin boards, Silas opened a file cabinet marked Watch List, Civic Entities. He thumbed through until he found it. The Rathmore Foundation. Officially, it was a non-profit specializing in youth outreach and foster care advocacy. Unofficially, it had long drawn whispers of misused funds and untraceable adoptions, but no hard evidence had ever surfaced. It was operated by Gideon and Celine Rathmore, affluent, polished, untouchable. The kind of couple who smiled too perfectly at charity galas and disappeared behind tinted car windows. He remembered Celine especially, slender, statuesque, with raven black hair, always pinned in a classic chignon. Her eyes were sharp enough to draw blood, her speech calculated and silk-wrapped. Gideon, her husband, was all charm and composure, tall and silver-haired, a former venture capitalist turned philanthropist after what he called a spiritual awakening. But Silas had never bought it. There was something about their whole act that rang hollow. Silas picked up the phone and dialed the number for Dr. Mabel Hawthorne. The line clicked. Then her brisk, low voice answered, "Hawthorne Clinic." "Mabel, it's Silas. I need to talk to you about something. Delicate." Mabel Hawthorne, 62, had the presence of a woman who had learned long ago to find order in chaos. She was tall and bony, with ash-blonde hair that curled just slightly at the ends and eyes that missed nothing. Life had carved its marks on her. Her husband's death in the fire of '09, the loss of her only son to overdose in a city far away, but none of it had broken her, only sharpened her edges. She was known to be as fiercely protective as she was perceptive. Silas filled her in, sparing no details about the wire transfer Russell Pike and the Rathmores. When he mentioned the name, there was a pause. "I know that name," Mabel said slowly. "One of the adoption agencies we looked into for a case back in '21, a girl named Alyssa, disappeared right after being placed. Parents claimed she ran away, but the timeline didn't add up. I filed a report. Never heard back." Silas exhaled through his nose. "Figures." Mabel lowered her voice. "There's more. I had a look at the mark behind June's ear again this morning. It's clearer in daylight. Numbers. Silas. A faded tattoo, 418. Silas didn't reply immediately. He turned in his chair, watching the snow spiral outside the window like flakes of ash. "I think it's a tracking code," she added. "Some kind of identification system. Maybe something institutional or something darker." Silas muttered. Meanwhile, in a quiet room down the hall, June sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since they'd pulled her from the fire. A nurse had combed her hair now, tied in a loose braid. Her wrists were still red from where the chains had rubbed skin, raw. A small knock interrupted the silence. Willa Monroe stepped in, carrying a coloring book and a handful of crayons. She was 8 petite for her age, with curly dark brown hair and wide amber eyes that seemed too solemn for someone her size. She hadn't spoken a word since her mother's funeral over a year ago. Willa sat down beside June without a word. Bruno followed, settling at June's feet, his warm breath fogging the linoleum. The golden retriever let out a soft whine, nuzzling June's hand. She responded with a slow movement, her fingers curling into his fur. Then Willa reached into her book bag and pulled out a blank page. She wrote a single name, June. She held it up between them, her eyes searching June's. June blinked. Then almost imperceptibly she nodded. A decision. A choice. From across the room, a surveillance monitor blinked with soft light, recording every moment in grainy clarity. Later that night, Silas reviewed Willa's drawings. She had always preferred to express herself in images rather than words. Her latest sketch sent a chill down his spine. A wide marble building with white columns, faceless figures leading children by the hand into looming doors. Each child had a number on their back. June's was unmistakable. 418, the same number tattooed behind her ear. The pieces were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was far more disturbing than Silas had feared. The winter sun struggled through the pale clouds over Elk Hollow, casting a watery sheen across the snow-laden branches of the pines. Outside the Elk Hollow Sheriff's Department, frost curled like lace on the window panes, the quiet town still wrapped in the hush of the post-blizzard thaw inside. However, a storm brewed silently in Sheriff Silas Monroe's mind. Sheriff Silas, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with grizzled temples and lines that came not from age but from the burden of watching too many truths unfold, paced slowly in his office. His eyes storm gray like the horizon before thunder rested on the papers laid out before him. One of them bore the name Rathmore Foundation, and another a scanned adoption certificate for a girl named June. She was resting again in the guest room of Mabel Hawthorne's clinic under careful watch. Ever since she had scribbled her name with hesitant fingers, June, in blocky letters she hadn't uttered a sound. But it was her eyes that spoke volumes, especially when she was visited by Willa. Monroe, Silas's 8-year-old daughter, had changed since the fire. Her silence had deepened not from fear, but from a sense of responsibility that no child should carry. Her long auburn hair now always fell over one shoulder, as if to shield the world from seeing too much. She spent her hours drawing each picture a whisper of things adults couldn't understand. On the second afternoon after June's rescue, a sleek black SUV rolled into the snow-dusted lot of the sheriff's station. It was spotless, out of place, in Elk Hollow's muddy thaw. From it stepped 2 figures, tall, polished, and wrapped in thick wool coats of camel and charcoal. The man was Gideon Rathmore, in his early 50s, with a square jaw and meticulously combed silver-streaked hair. Gideon carried the air of someone accustomed to power. His bespoke coat clung perfectly to his trim frame, and his dark gloves looked untouched by wind or weather. At his side, Celine Rathmore floated like winter smoke. With porcelain skin, a petite figure, and an emotionless grace, she spoke with a voice soft enough to feel artificial. They introduced themselves with crisp precision, flashing state-sealed documents proclaiming them to be June's legal adoptive parents. The paperwork was impeccable, the ink fresh, the signatures consistent. But something in the way. Celine glanced around, calculating cold, and the way Gideon referred to June as the child made the hair on Silas's neck rise. "She's been through an ordeal," Gideon said with professional concern. "We just want to take her home." But when June was brought to the sheriff's station, her reaction turned everything on its head. The moment her wide hazel eyes landed on the pair, she froze. Then came the trembling. Her breath stuttered, and in a heartbeat she screamed not with words, but with a raw, primal sound that cracked the room's quiet open like ice on a river. She tried to back away, knocking over a chair, her small hands clutching at the air behind her for something, until Bruno stepped between them. Bruno had been watching from the hallway. The 6-year-old golden retriever, thick-coated and regal in his bearing, moved with purpose. The golden of his fur caught the light like flame as he placed himself between June and the visitors. His ears pricked. A low, rolling growl emerged from his throat, deep, protective, unmistakably threatening. Celine gasped. Gideon reached out, but Bruno didn't flinch. The dog's eyes, normally full of warmth, had darkened like the storm outside. It wasn't training. It was instinct. Something in Gideon triggered him. Silas's voice was steel when he stepped in. "We'll need to verify this documentation. She's not going anywhere tonight." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Sheriff, we've driven 6 hours for this, and I'm asking you to wait. We're not putting her through more trauma because of paperwork. She'll remain under medical care until further notice." Dr. Mabel Hawthorne, who had been quietly observing, now stepped forward. "She has extensive bruising and burn scarring. If she's been in your care, I'd like to understand why her medical records don't reflect any of it." Her voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was glacial. Celine blinked once slowly. "She had an accident before we adopted her. A kitchen fire. She was treated elsewhere, but Mabel was already flipping through her own file. There are inconsistencies. No prior medical visits under her current alias. No burns logged. No broken wrist history. Yet she's healing from one. And no record of trauma response therapy, though. She clearly exhibits chronic abuse symptoms." Silas's eyes narrowed. "I'll be contacting the State Child Welfare Office. In the meantime, the girl stays here." Outside, Willa waited on the clinic porch, bundled in her wool coat, watching the snow fall in heavy flakes. She felt things others had since her mother died. And when June was brought out flanked by Mabel and Silas, Willa silently extended a mittened hand. June hesitated, then slipped her hand into Willa's. No words, just warmth. And Bruno walked beside them, tail low but alert, glancing once more over his shoulder at the black SUV. Back inside, Mabel returned to her files. After the incident, she'd re-examined the adoption paperwork and found another subtle inconsistency. The date of adoption had been digitally altered. A trace signature error. It gave her chills. She made a quiet call to an old contact in the state records office. As for Willa, she would later draw what she saw that day. Not the fear, but the moment. June took her hand. In the drawing, June had a crown of soft light and Bruno. He stood like a knight. Fur, bristling eyes bright. At the bottom, Willa wrote only one word. Safe. Snow clung to the ridges of Crestwood like a reluctant ghost, draping every rooftop tree branch and telephone wire with cold memory. Sheriff Silas Monroe sat in his dimly lit office, the amber glow from a desk lamp barely touching the edges of the old photographs lining his corkboard photos of children, long gone, smiling stiffly in adoption profiles. His fingers hovered over one worn file labeled Eliza Monroe. Accidental fall. The corners softened by years of unopened truth. Eliza, his late wife, had been meticulous in her role as an archivist in the county's child welfare department. Tall and willowy with russet hair, often tied back into a strict bun. Eliza had a voice that rarely rose, but carried the weight of iron. She had died 6 years ago, slipped and fallen down the stairs of the courthouse basement. They'd said Silas had swallowed the official story because the grief had left no room for suspicion. But now, revisiting the layers of adoption records connected to the Rathmore Foundation inconsistencies screamed louder than denial. Most notably, a string of files, all reviewed by Eliza within the weeks before her death, flagged with annotations in her tidy cursive, led back to one name, Gideon Rathmore. Across the room, Bruno stirred. The 8-year-old golden retriever was curled by the heater, but his head snapped up when Silas opened a plastic bag containing Eliza's old sheriff windbreaker. It still held her scent faint, but enough to rouse something primal in the dog. Bruno approached slowly, nose twitching, and as Silas laid the jacket on the floor, Bruno stiffened. Then he growled not a warning, but a deep, guttural sound. Silas hadn't heard in years. The reaction had been identical when Bruno caught a whiff of the interior of the Rathmores' rental vehicle. That alone might have seemed coincidental if not for the trail of falsified records, the terror in June's eyes. And now this. That evening, Silas made his way to Crestwood Regional Medical, where June was still under care. Willa had insisted on tagging along. She now carried a small sketch pad wherever she went, a gift from Dr. Mabel. Willa's speech was still fractured, only emerging when near June, but it was enough that soft whisper of connection was a miracle in itself. Inside June's room, the lighting was gentle warm. June was seated by the window, her pale arms wrapped around her knees, eyes watching the swirl of snow outside. At her feet, Bruno lay like a golden shadow. When Willa entered, June turned. No words were spoken, but their eyes met with a quiet understanding. Willa moved closer, pulled a crayon from her jacket pocket, and drew something swiftly in her notebook. She turned the page to Silas. A house, but not just any house. One with gleaming pillars, two perfect hedges, and faceless children lined at its marble steps. Above it, written in shaky block letters, Rathmore. Silas crouched beside her, heart hammering. "Did you see this?" June reached over, took the crayon, and drew a small star above one of the children's heads. Then, slowly, she pointed to herself. "Jesus," Silas muttered. Later that night, Silas reviewed Eliza's accident file. He hadn't looked at it in years, but this time things felt different. He noticed a missing page in the medical examiner's notes, a tampered timestamp on the security footage log, and a photograph clipped to the back of a file that should have never been there. Eliza, at her desk, scanning adoption folders marked confidential, he leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house stretching heavy. Willa slept in the next room. June in the guest room down the hall. Bruno sat watch at the door like a statue of loyalty. And suddenly it all fit together, like bones in a shallow grave. Dr. Mabel Hawthorne had called earlier that afternoon, asking if Silas had seen the most recent revisions to the Rathmores' adoption certificate. The scarring inconsistencies weren't just minor oversights, they were total fabrications. No child with June's medical profile could have been declared in perfect health 3 months ago, she'd said. The next morning, Silas drove to the last person he could trust with something like this, Dale Hargrave, a retired private investigator with a reputation for unearthing dirty secrets. Dale was a wiry man with a sharp chin and sharper eyes. His house, a ranch-style cabin, was decorated in dusty football memorabilia and unopened whiskey bottles. He looked like a man who used to believe in the system until it failed someone he loved. "I need to know what Eliza found," Silas said, "and I need you to be quiet about it." Dale tapped a pencil against his knee. Thoughtful. Rathmore's been clean on the surface for years, but people don't send $50,000 to a foundation anonymously unless there's something dark under the marble. "You give me 3 days." Back home, Willa and June had built a fort in the living room out of couch cushions and quilts. They whispered in their own quiet language, their eyes lighting up at the sight of Bruno trying to wedge himself beneath the blanket. And in the kitchen, Silas stared at the burner, coffee gone cold. He opened the drawer, took out a worn notepad, and wrote just one line. Eliza knew. The wind clawed through the pines of South Maple Ridge, brushing over the old hunting cabin that stood tucked in a shallow fold of the hills, forgotten to most, but not to Silas Monroe. Snow clung to its roof like a second skin, and the chimney, cold for years, now pulsed with quiet smoke again. Inside, Sheriff Silas paced slowly in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. His flannel sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars, remnants from years in the field. His expression was more weathered now, deeply lined from stress, his eyes never resting too long in one spot. June sat curled on the old corduroy armchair, wrapped in a plaid blanket, far too big for her. Her thin frame trembled slightly, though from fear more than cold. Across the cabin, Willa Monroe. Silas's 9-year-old daughter sat cross-legged on a faded rug, sketching quietly. Her long strawberry blonde hair was unkempt, falling into her eyes, and her hand moved with quiet intensity. Ever since she began speaking again, only around June, she had found solace in drawing what her voice still struggled to express. Bruno lay between the two girls, his body alert despite a light limp in his back leg. The 7-year-old golden retriever had changed since his canine days, but his senses had not dulled. He occasionally lifted his head, sniffed the air, and then returned to his watchful pose. Earlier that morning, Silas had received confirmation. Perfect Haven, the seemingly spotless rehabilitation center for disadvantaged youth, was in fact a trafficking front. Hidden beneath charitable layers and glowing PR, it had funneled children into private adoptions and under-the-table transfers. A recent financial trace had uncovered that the Rathmore Foundation, Gideon and Celine's sprawling nonprofit, had been laundering money through it. The FBI, brought in under the radar by Silas's quiet persistence, and with help from Dr. Mabel Hawthorne's medical records, had just launched a joint investigation. But there were whispers someone had tipped the Rathmores off. The decision to retreat to the old cabin hadn't been easy, but Silas knew this place just as Eliza once had. His late wife, Eliza Monroe, had used it as a weekend escape, even secretly outfitting the root cellar beneath it as an emergency storm shelter just in case. She used to say that just in case had arrived. It came with the snow. It was close to midnight when the stillness broke. A crack. Then another Silas turned his head. The wind had shifted, blowing snow against the windows. Then Bruno stood, a growl vibrating deep in his chest, his ears pinned back, eyes locked toward the door. Another sound, a footstep on the porch. Boards, girl's basement. Now, Silas whispered. Reaching for the rifle, leaned near the door. Bruno growled louder, nudging June first, then Willa. They obeyed immediately, June gripping Willa's hand. Bruno followed close behind as Silas slid open the old trapdoor beneath the kitchen rug. The girls slipped into the narrow stone tunnel. Bruno paused. He looked back at Silas once before nudging the door closed with his nose. It clicked shut just as the cabin door exploded open. 4 figures stormed in, faces, masked movements practiced. One was tall, statuesque, wrapped in a dark wool coat with a fur collar. Even through the storm, Silas recognized the way she moved Celine Rathmore. "Where is she?" Celine's voice sliced through the room like ice. She stepped forward, brushing a strand of silver hair behind one ear. "I should ask you that." "Where are the others?" Silas said, standing firm, his rifle ready. Celine smiled, but it never touched her eyes. "It's not about one girl, Sheriff. It never was. It's about control. It's about order. You sell children." Silas growled. "You kill to cover it." Celine's expression twisted. Shots erupted. Silas ducked, firing once, grazing one of the masked men. The others returned. Fire, splinters flew. The walls trembled. Silas dove behind the kitchen counter. Down in the root cellar, the girls huddled. Willa clutched June's hand tightly. The narrow space smelled of earth and old preserves, but it felt safe. Almost sacred. Bruno stood at the door, ears twitching at every thump above. And then he remembered. It was like muscle memory. Years ago, during a flood drill, Eliza had trained him. Tap the lever under the shelf. Nose the crate, shift the latch. He repeated the movements now with uncanny precision. A small tunnel at the back of the cellar opened just enough for the girls to crawl through. Bruno barked once softly, then guided the girls into the passage, his body shielding them. The tunnel led to a stone shed, half a mile down the ridge, unmarked, long forgotten. Above, the attackers had spread out. Celine moved like a shadow circling the cabin, but Silas wasn't there anymore. Bruno burst through the trees like a golden comet covered in snow and blood from a cut along his shoulder. He charged one of the masked men, standing guard outside, leaping, knocking him flat. Celine turned too late. Silas tackled her in the snow, pinning her with a knee. "You murdered my wife," he whispered. Gun against her temple. Celine only smiled. "You still don't get it." She chose to interfere just like you did, but it was over. Sirens rang out from down the valley. The FBI convoy alerted through a hidden radio Silas had left in the barn had arrived. They found June and Willa in the hidden shed, wrapped in an emergency blanket. Bruno lying beside them with his body curled protectively around their feet. He didn't move until Silas opened the door. The courtroom was chilled despite the spring sun rising outside the glass-paneled windows of the Helena Federal Building. Montana's rugged skyline loomed beyond. But inside a storm of another kind was brewing truth clawing its way out of silence. Agent Lydia Cartwright, a woman in her late 40s with short-cropped silver hair and the resolute posture of someone who had spent decades staring down criminals, stood before the press with measured confidence. She had uncovered the encrypted registry of Perfect Haven the night before a sprawling coded archive detailing the sale of over 200 children through a hidden auction platform masked as adoption. One string of digits kept surfacing again and again. 418, Lydia repeated at the briefing. A high-value designation used for children with certain desirable genetics, light eyes, symmetrical features, high intelligence potential. They were cataloged, ranked, and sold. June was one of the highest-priced assets ever listed. In a secure room upstairs, June sat between Dr. Mabel Hawthorne and Sheriff Silas Monroe. Her hands trembled, clutching a worn plush rabbit that had survived the explosion in Chapter 1. Bruno, the 8-year-old golden retriever with a deep auburn coat now threaded with gray, rested his head on her knee. His side still bore the scars of the ambush at the cabin, but his eyes never left hers. He was the only anchor in her storm. Mabel, a tall, graceful woman in her 60s with dark skin and sharp eyes that had seen too much, gently placed a hand over June's. "They'll ask questions, but you only say what you're ready for." Mabel had spent the last 2 weeks poring over files hidden beneath layers of false medical history. She had discovered the truth. June's real name was June Elizabeth Monroe. She was the granddaughter of Eliza Monroe, Silas's late wife. A DNA test confirmed it. June had been reported dead in the same car crash that had killed Eliza, or so they had believed. But it was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated abduction designed to silence a whistleblower and erase a child. Meanwhile, in the adjacent hallway, Willa Monroe stood holding a folder of crayon drawings. Her own testimony. The little girl, now 8, had not only begun to speak again, but had insisted on being part of the hearing. She wore a soft blue cardigan and a hair clip shaped like a sunflower, her mother's favorite flower. For weeks, Willa had drawn the same scene over and over. Children in a white building, with marble columns lined up like goods. Today, for the first time, she would speak of it. In the main courtroom, Gideon Rathmore, once the charitable face of the Rathmore Foundation, sat in handcuffs flanked by U.S. Marshals. His tailored suit hung awkwardly on his hunched frame. The confident air he once carried long since broken. His wife, Celine, had vanished before the FBI raid. She was now on the run, considered armed and dangerous. Judge Caroline Bell, a stern woman in her late 50s with sharp cheekbones and a reputation for empathy matched only by her intolerance for corruption, called the session to order. The air tightened. First came the evidence bank records, internal memos, emails coded in false philanthropy, and the damning list of numbers. Agent Cartwright's voice never faltered. Then came the testimony. June walked to the stand in silence. She stood on a small wooden box so her head could be seen above the microphone. For a moment she froze. The courtroom seemed to lean forward with her breath. Then Willa from the front row whispered, "You can." And June did. "My name is June," she said softly, "not 418. She described the days of silence, the marble house, the cold baths, the white room where people in masks measured her height and asked her to smile. They said I was going to a perfect family, but it wasn't perfect. It was a cage. There wasn't a sound in the room. Later, Willa was called. She stepped onto the witness box with quiet bravery. She held up one drawing, a child locked behind glass, and pointed at it. That's what they did to her. Outside, press cameras blinked like insects. The world was watching. Meanwhile, Dr. Mabel, in her quiet office, drafted a statement to the Federal Review Board. She proposed legislation June's Law to overhaul private adoption databases and create an independent ethics commission. She was tired of reacting. It was time to prevent Bruno, now resting in a shaded corner beside June's bed, that night stirred. His dreams came in fragments. Eliza's voice, the cold steel of training platforms, the faint scent of lavender she used to wear. When he woke, June's hand was already resting on his paw. He had led them through fire, and now he would see them to safety. The hearing adjourned with Judge Bell's ruling. All assets and holdings of Rathmore Foundation to be seized. Gideon would stand trial for human trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. But the greatest victory came not in law, but in the moment. June smiled, truly smiled when the gavel fell. She was free, not just legally, but in her soul. She was no longer 418. She was June Monroe, granddaughter, survivor, witness. And thanks to a girl who spoke through drawings and a dog who never left her side, the world now knew her name. The air in Maple Hollow smelled different now, less like ash and doubt and more like cinnamon and pine. A full year had passed since the last snowstorm brought truth buried in silence and fire. The seasons had changed, but some wounds, though healing, never truly fade. Still, in the Monroe home, a quiet joy had begun to take root. June was no longer just a name whispered behind a locked jaw. Her legal name now read Hannah Ellis. Monroe, a name chosen not just for its melody but for its truth. Hannah, the girl who survived fire and silence, was now officially the adopted daughter of Sheriff Silas Monroe. At 15, her frame had filled out slightly, though her eyes retained the weight of someone who had lived far more than her years allowed. Her long, dark hair, once tangled and hidden beneath a hood, was now often braided by Willa, who had quickly taken to the role of younger sister with fierce loyalty. Silas stood on the porch that morning, mug in hand, steam curling like lazy ghosts toward the pale sky. His once rigid posture had softened over the past year. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed but longer than before, and though his voice still carried the command of a lawman, there was a tenderness, now a subtle tremble, especially when he spoke to Hannah. Inside the house, laughter drifted like music. Willa Monroe. Now 9 had grown tall for her age, her red curls untamed and wild as her spirit. Though once selectively mute, she now spoke with clarity and surprising insight, especially when discussing the star stories she and Hannah invented each night. Her therapist often remarked on the transformation, calling it nothing short of miraculous. But Silas knew miracles had 4 legs and golden fur. Bruno lay near the fireplace, his body slower now, his muzzle graying, but his eyes alert. He was nearly 11, a golden retriever once trained as a rescue and therapy dog, alongside Eliza Silas's late wife. After surviving gunfire, fire, and grief, he now bore a gentle limp but refused to stay far from the girls. His preferred spot was beside the staircase where he could see both the front door and the couch, always watching. That evening, the house was dimly lit by strands of soft yellow bulbs. A quilt of fading light stretched across the wooden floor as the sun dipped behind the evergreens. The ritual was simple but sacred. One paper star, folded carefully pinned to the ceiling above the girls' shared room. Each star held a story, a good thing from that day. Some were tiny triumphs. Willa got a math answer right on the first try. Others were monumental. Bruno barked in his sleep like he used to when dreaming of Eliza. On this night, Hannah held the newest star in her hand. "I spoke in front of class today," she said, her voice still soft but steady. Willa's eyes widened and she clapped, then reached for the pin box. "That's not just a star, that's a constellation," Willa declared. As they added the star, Silas watched from the doorway. His heart ached, but it was a sweet ache, the kind born from restoration. He thought of Eliza and her dreams of a home filled with light, and how Bruno had led the girls through the hidden storm bunker she had once built beneath the cabin, something he never thought they'd need. Outside, the wind had picked up, shaking the cedar trees. A car pulled into the gravel driveway. It was Dr. Mabel Hawthorne, now a family friend. Tall and composed, Mabel wore her silver hair in a tight bun and carried herself like a woman who had long ago stopped fearing controversy. Her presence always meant something important, never casual. Tonight, her eyes shone with both joy and resolve. "I came to drop this off," she said, handing Silas a manila envelope. DNA results from the FBI files. Silas furrowed his brow, stepping aside. Inside, Mabel joined the girls by the fireplace, patting Bruno's head as he perked up. The envelope contained a single document, but its words hit Silas like thunder. Hannah Ellis Monroe, biological daughter of Ellis Hawthorne, sister to Eliza Monroe. He read it again, then looked at Mabel, who nodded. "Eliza's younger brother," she whispered. "He died in a car crash years ago. His girlfriend was pregnant. Nobody knew until now." Silas stared at the fire emotions colliding. Grief, awe, destiny. Hannah wasn't just someone they saved, she was family. Truly. Eliza's niece. A part of her lived on in this brave girl. Mabel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were meant to find her." Upstairs, Hannah and Willa were drawing a new story for their star journal. Tonight's tale featured a golden knight named Bruno, and a castle with secret tunnels that led to truth. They didn't know the envelope had changed their lives again, but maybe they didn't need to know yet. Some truths could wait until after the stars were hung. Sometimes miracles do not come with lightning or thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly hidden in the eyes of a wounded child, in the loyalty of an aging dog, or in the silent bond between two hearts that refuse to give up. Hannah's story was never just about rescue. It was about restoration, the kind that only love, faith, and divine timing can orchestrate. God often places the right people and even the right animals in our paths, not by accident but by intention. Through the ashes of sorrow, a new family was formed. Through silence, voices found their way back, and through the cold of betrayal, a home filled with warmth was rebuilt. One paper star at a time. If you believe that no pain is wasted, that no story is beyond redemption, and that God can turn broken pieces into something whole again, then let this be a reminder: miracles are real. You are never truly lost. You are never truly alone. May God bless every person watching this. May He give you the strength to protect the vulnerable, the eyes to see beauty in the broken, and the heart to act with courage. Just like Silas, just like Willa, just like Bruno. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below with the word Amen if you believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of love, rescue, and divine grace.